honestly answer that, and it's an annex of what the paper's there, and perhaps it might help you objectively reporting about all of this. It's very complicated. The Treasury holds a different figure to the ONS, and the people have got many different views on it. But an undisputed 10 billion, in my view, of savings if we left, and I've also explained to you how I think we could deal with it.
Right.
As to Mr. Farage, I'll answer
£10 billion a week
I'll answer
is
the question.
£10 billion a year is 190 million a week. That's what you agree.
I asked the question. You asked the question.
Yes.
I've given you the answer.
So £10 billion a year.
Yes, I've given you the answer.
Which is 190 million a
perhaps
week.
you might think that some other people are going to ask a question. I've given you the answer.
But I'm just saying it's not on the side of the bus. On the side of the bus is 350 million a week, which is 20 billion a year.
Whose side are you on in this debate? Are you in a side of objective truth or not? I've given you the objective truth, and it's in the annex, and I hope you read it. Now, it's a question of Farage. I don't hold that view because I have confidence enough in the British people that they will not resort to violence. They don't resort to violence even in the most extreme circumstances we've had, in long strikes and other issues. And we have seen off the British National Front, and we have seen off most of these expressionist movements. But unless we tackle the concerns about immigration, which are genuine and real, and utilize our capacity to make the savings which I've said in those areas of the country that need alleviation, in the National Health Service, in housing, and in education, we will go on perpetuating this dissociation, really, of abate millions of our people from its elite, and I think warn about that. Next question.
You didn't ask about Boris, by the way.
Oh, Boris. Well, I personally think that in the context that he was talking about, which is the different empires that have arisen in Europe, all of which have failed, from Charlemagne onwards, he's right to point out that this drive for expansion, for more size, that size alone faces it, and size with the currency, after all, Charlemagne started it, and that currency failed. Perfectly reasonable to point out that there have been many different expansions, and I'm not going to go into them all, but that's perfectly reasonable comment. If you want to, he said, by very different methods, and I think, of course, everybody knew what he meant by very different methods, and I think that, again, this is a grotesque example of trying to rubbish somebody's reputation on the basis of no evidence whatever. Yes? Yes. Yeah.
Following on from our ITV friend's last question, just by way of balance, do you think it perhaps ill-behoves the Prime Minister of our country to be talking in such emotive terms as the implications of a Leave vote being, for example, to make World War III more likely, and also perhaps to make it that ISIS would perhaps prefer us to vote Leave? Do you think those are also examples of intemperate language?
I wrote what I wanted to about the claim that the Third World War was inevitable in the Sun newspaper, and they expressed it pretty graphically in a cartoon effect, photographic cartoon of Churchill. As far as the ISIL one, I think that we've seen a huge number of exaggerated and ridiculous propaganda movements, and I'm sure we'll all pick our best, but I should have said worst. But the Prime Minister's saying that ISIL would be happy on a Brexit is the most extraordinary statement of all. Of all. And I think we've got to be very careful about this whole security question. A decent silence is quite a good idea on most of the issues of security, and that applies to both MI6 and MI5. I was responsible for 2.5 years for MI6, and I believe it's an outstanding organization. But its strength and its virtues are it is silent. We used to call the Navy the silent service. And it's not a good or pretty sight seeing these various arguments about security being played around in this issue. We all know perfectly well that as far as borders and countries' borders, sharing information to deal with terrorism is done to their best of ability across all countries. Now, even Russia participates in very helpful intelligence transfers and has done. To some extent, that's been perhaps lessened in recent years, but I hope it is soon restored. And we need to be very careful about this. And I don't believe it's exclusive to the EU. All EU countries will pass on information to non-EU countries wherever it makes sense, and all NATO countries. The problem is that what information you pass is itself very difficult to do. Sometimes you're bound, you can't do it. So I just think that that's another example where you can very easily get into the gutter of politics by raising such an important, normally bipartisanly handled issue such as security. Right at the back.
So David, on my travels I meet a lot of people who particularly agree with most of the principles that you've discussed today, and they understand this loss of sovereignty, and yet this is trumped by their short-term personal economic concerns of the risks. What advice would you give them?
Well, take a longer view. Now, it's perfectly understandable that people with certain commitments and certain feelings, either in their job or elsewhere, might take the view, my job is more at risk than others, and it will affect their voting behaviour. And that's perfectly reasonable. And giving objective facts to people on this is not unreasonable. But, you know, we do know certain things. We do know that trade agreements are entered into for mutual advantage. Nobody does it on any other basis, and that's what it's always been, and always should be. And so when people predict that you will not make trade agreements, they know that they are not telling the truth. The question for us as a campaign is we're not the government. We aren't into those negotiations. We don't know what is going to be the response of the European single market, the EU, which contains some countries that are not even in it. And we ought to have had all those objective information put before us, as I said, first to the Cabinet, then to Parliament, and then at an election, if you have a manifesto commitment to have a referendum, have the referendum, but have it fairly. You know, that's the issue. Why do you have referendum? It's because parties are split. If in a referendum, the Cabinet Secretary has a very heavy responsibility to try and make sure that it doesn't just become another way of getting the Prime Minister's way. The Cabinet Secretary, I sometimes wonder whether he knows the meaning of the word cabinet and thinks it's a sort of piece of furniture which should be moved from time to time to whichever Prime Minister he happens to be serving as a sort of presidential seat. Now, we've got to get back to some standards of objectivity and truth. We didn't in the 1975 referendum handle the relationship between the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office and the campaign very well, and we have since then learnt on referendums. That's why we have designated groupings. It seems to me absolutely extraordinary. The Prime Minister should deciding who he should stand up against. The designated group should choose who takes part in these various encounters, whether it's ITV or BBC or Sky, and then the Prime Minister should be part of it if he wants to be. We're in the Purdah period. We need objectivity. Otherwise, referendum will fall into total disrepute. Maybe people want that to happen. But it is a device when parties aren't conflicted, and it needs objectiveness and truth, and people will vote, as you say, sometimes on their pockets. After all, they do in general elections. Jim Callaghan coined the phrase, the jingle in the pocket. This is not something to disparage, but I think they ought to look at unemployment levels in Europe. They ought to look at some of the consequences of what's happening out there in the organization which they're being asked to remain in, right? Yeah.
Do you believe that it's economically literate, not economically illiterate, but literate to believe that uncapped immigration, typically lower skilled and unskilled workers, i.e. excessive supply for fixed demand, will push down the price of labour, push down wages, and that's what we're seeing?
Well, the trouble is that the economists who've looked at this have come up with very conflicting views. Common sense would say it would, well, at least hold wages, they wouldn't rise as fast. And that's one of the reasons why employers like it, and I think we've got to be quite blunt about that. But there are other benefits, of course, that come from having immigrant labour. The problem is this free movement of labour provision. It was fine when we were a community of 9 It was fine when we were a community of 15. When we made the good decision and the right decision to take in a lot of other countries from Eastern Europe, it became a major issue. And then we have the Prime Minister. I know under pressure he was from Angela Merkel in order to do a deal with Turkey, but to say that you were going to speed up the entry of Turkey into the EU, when we've all known that freedom of movement of labour is one of the reasons why we've stopped and slowed down Turkey's application. It seems to me you're in danger of giving, it's this presentism, this pretend, so that Turkish people feel that they soon will be in the European Union. When they discover they're not, I only hope they don't, in disillusionment, pull out of NATO, where I believe they play an extremely important and valuable role. But nobody's saying that everybody would come, but it would certainly, a country of 75 million, would add to the likely numbers that are coming in. And as I say, we've all underestimated it before. And I want to see ONS, which I respect incidentally, given a greater role in this, and the government step right back from it. ONS insisted in the 1970 election that we publish the balance of payments figures, to the embarrassment of the then Labour government, when I was kicked out of government. Very salutary, very important. I've been kicked out of government twice, in 70 and in 1979. Didn't feel like it at the time, but in retrospect, I think it was a perfectly reasonable decision. A lot of this is about, can you kick the buggers out? You can't in many parts of the European Union. In many aspects of European life, it's quite impossible to make a democratic political choice, and qualified voting, necessary for a single market, I don't deny that, but it does mean you lose an awful lot of votes, and sometimes votes on important matters. And incidentally, I think that's what Mr. Bloomberg should be worried about. How much safeguarding is there for the City of London, as in the If You Remain? Not a lot, in my view. There have been eyeing the City of London for years. I think there will be another move to check it. And all the Prime Minister's got, basically, is you can raise this matter in the European Council. No provision for a vote, no automatic right to do so. That was pointed out by the Deputy Chairman of the Bank of England the other day. So be careful, look at the small print of these commitments of how the EU has not been reformed by the Prime Minister's renegotiation any more than it was reformed by the renegotiation of Harold Wilson and Jim Callaghan. And most of us knew that in 1975, and all of you know it in 2000 and wherever we are. Okay, yes.
Lord Owen, I'm trying to work out from your speech whether or not are you accusing Sir Jeremy Hayward of not having prepared economic options papers and shown them to the Cabinet before the Prime Minister called the referendum or not? And can I ask you, do you think that Sir Jeremy should stay in office, or is it time for him to go?
It's not my job to, the civil service are protected by civil service procedures, and quite rightly so that they are not, they don't lose their jobs at the say-so of a politician, even the Prime Minister. Of course it does effectively, can change it. No, I'm not going to get into whether it is employment or not. I will get into his responsibilities, which is to ensure that there is a proper level playing field for the debate during the referendum, and in particular as we get closer to it. And I do think that we have seen evidence that the views of the Treasury, which are now presented in a referendum period about leaving, as I understand it, none of those assessments, none of that analysis ever went to the Cabinet before the Prime Minister made his speech, perhaps inappropriately, at Bloomberg's. And furthermore, that they did not present a similar assessment, anything remotely like, I gather practically nothing at all, before the manifesto commitment, which both told us we were going to have a referendum if they won the election, and also fixed the parameters for it, that it had to take place before 2017. So here we are, in 2016, having a referendum, and suddenly hearing what the Treasury apparently think of it. Well, all I'm saying is that type of analysis, that type of gloom and doom should have been heard around the Cabinet paper before you even called a referendum. And I think that's just a basic fundamental constitutional duty of the civil service, and as the Cabinet Secretary is the head of the civil service, to see that it is placed in front of them. They are not just serving the Prime Minister, they are serving the Cabinet of different views and different people, and that should have been presented. And I think it was a grave dereliction of duty that it was not.
Could I just say, they keep saying this is the final time that we can get in or out. For instance, if they gave Turkey free access, couldn't we just vote to come out? How can they keep us imprisoned if they change their views and policies?
Well, to admit a new member to the European Union, it has to be a unanimous decision. So we have got a veto over the admission of Turkey. We have a veto on some aspects, very much curtailed. If you look at the issues you could have vetoed way back when we joined in '73, they're very much less. But we do have some vetoes on that. We have some vetoes on some aspects of defence still. But all the time they are eroded. They're eroded by the European Court of Justice, which is basically set up with the aim of having eventually a United States of Europe. And still we haven't changed the treaties over the euro. The euro actually, in the Treaty of Maastricht, says that all member states are heading towards the euro, except for ourselves and the Danes that have an opt-out. Sweden, which is the economy does fulfill the characteristics to be able to go in, has stayed outside, arguably in contradiction to the treaty. They create some sort of, and they fluff it, they flambe it. And that's the same for some other countries. But basically, the things that we can veto are not very great. And what we will find if we stay is, because of the Prime Minister's commitments not to interfere on the euro structuring or on deepening, that they move ever more towards a United States of Europe, and we never really come to a point where we can't. Then somebody like the equivalent of Michael Heseltine argues, or Ken Clarke argues inside a Conservative government, there's no problem, it will also be done inside Labour governments, to go into the euro. And they will go into the euro. Now, at the moment, we have a commitment, we have to have a referendum for that. And actually, under our constitution, it's perfectly possible for a government to say, we will make this a manifesto pledge, and then that overrides a referendum. And that's exactly what Labour asked to be done on membership of the EU in 1983. So they wanted to deprive you of the referendum. Well, it didn't help them, but it is constitutionally capable of doing it. So this business saying we will never join the euro is manifestly untrue. You could either decide to do it and have a referendum and say to people, you know, the Eurozone might reform. We might be faced then with purely political decisions. The Eurozone's okay economically. People say, well, now we can go in. The political ramifications of joining a single currency are huge in terms of becoming part of the United States of Europe. It's a snaffle process that we're watching and observing.
Could I just follow on? How do you?
I think one question each, if you don't mind.
Just with regards to, obviously...
Can you speak up? I'm having a bit of difficulty.
Mike, thanks. To what extent would you agree with Professor Patrick Minford insofar as regarding free trade agreements? Actually, there's somewhat of a red herring because, of course, notwithstanding the requirement under Article 50 to have one, and notwithstanding the fact that, for example, the EU concluded one with Ukraine in a matter of months, actually it's not politicians who dictate the terms of trade, it's businesses in one country that trade with businesses in another country. And simply having an agreement not to impose tariffs isn't necessary. You could simply not impose tariffs.
Well, for 20 years I've really been in business. I've not been a politician. And it is quite true that politicians keep on going to documents and regulations and forget that the fundamental trade is on price. Price is the key thing, and quality. If you get the price right and you get the quality, you'll penetrate any market. And Britain has shown that it can do this. After all, we've moved over the last 10 years, and Patrick Minford's book does explain this. We've moved away from the European single market 10% out to the global world. Now, if you can do that in 10 years, and you make a real determined commitment, and you make bilateral trade agreements, that shift can be much faster, in my view. So I think we need to be very careful about these. Are difficult questions. We have, in some areas of the EEA, advantageous trade terms for people getting through. Somebody who wants to stay selling into Europe will basically keep their manufactured products in line with European regulations. You give up the chance to influence those regulations, but on the other hand, it is only an influence, and you gain the chance to sell your goods in wider markets because you've got trade arrangements. These are balance of issues. But what is interesting, and this is the most important thing to remember, we hear from the corporates. They seem to dominate the news gathering procedures. Endlessly, heads of a big corporation are rolled out. These people are very happy to lobby in Brussels for a preferential deal for their large corporation. The people who are basically with us and growing in substantial numbers are the smaller businesses who really do feel the effects of the regulations and who want to be free to trade globally, want to have the shackles off, are entrepreneurial in mind, are adventurous in spirit, and are facing up to the need for this country to rejuvenate itself outside the EU and confident that you can do it. The politicians are largely not, but Minford has done a great deal of work on alternative models, markets, and everything like that. But at the end of the day, the message I come away from it is basically a contract between the seller and the buyer. And we keep forgetting this. These trade agreements are very marginal. I mean, and most of them are actually going to collapse. In my view, we're going to see most of these big American trade agreements. I mean, at the moment, the two presidential candidates are against the Asian trade agreement that Obama's negotiated. I don't think that's going to go very fast. These big trading agreements, this big thing, the inability of WTO to get trade agreements through is all part of this big institutional world. It's the people who think that they make the rules for a world which has become computerized, which has become much faster, much lighter on its feet. It's very different business. And I sometimes think, in talking to my political colleagues and friends, they forget that this business out there, you know, I used to be involved in trading steel. I mean, the rapidity with which they make their decisions on price would quite stagger you. And I mean, it's just a very different marketplace, the one that we see described in political documents. Now, last one question, right at the back. Yes, at the back.
To what extent will our dodgy postal vote system impact on the result of the referendum?
Voting system?
The postal voting system.
I really don't know. I mean, you know, there was a time when I would know, but I haven't fought an election since '87, and I really don't know. All I would say is this: I feel very, very strongly about this. The more people vote, the better. Now, I'm told that is against my interests. So be it. In a democracy, you want to have the maximum number of people voting. So I go around to universities encouraging young people to vote. That may or may not mean that more of them vote to stay, or more of them vote to leave. But I do want it to be clear that if we're going to respect this referendum, we have to respect the great majority of people to try and vote, and the rules and the regulations and the circumstances under which we do it need to be abided by from the Prime Minister downwards. If I had to say the three people who have done more to corrupt this process, it would be first the Prime Minister, second the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and thirdly the Cabinet Secretary. It is very, very serious development that we have not been able to hold a proper